Well, you know it's going to be a spicy video today when I started off with a content warning. Today I'm going to be talking about misogynistic violence, rape, and murder. So, good times. Last week, I stumbled upon a study that was just published in the British Journal of Sociology called "This is a Political Movement, Friend: Why Incels Support Violence." Man, incels, misogynistic terrorism, politics, science. I'm in, you crazy bastard. Katharina O'Donnell, a sociologist at Harvard, decided to take on the Herculean task of evaluating thousands of comments on an incel forum following the 2018 Toronto van attack, in which a self-described incel purposely plowed his van into pedestrians, killing 10 people and injuring another 16. If you are on this channel, you probably already know what an incel is, but just in case you're new here, incel stands for involuntary celibate. While it began life as a term coined by a lonely lesbian, it has been taken up as a title of honor primarily amongst angry young cis-hetero men who feel that they have no hope of ever being able to have sex with a woman. Usually, according to them, it's due to their physical looks. It's not synonymous with virgin. All of us have been a virgin at some point, and it's easily possible to be a grown adult virgin who doesn't consider themselves to be a victim and who doesn't virulently hate women or attractive men or the normies of society who ignore their plight. Incel encompasses all of that extra baggage. This recent paper simply examined how incels reacted to the van massacre and then identified the major themes in those reactions to better understand why extremist groups in general celebrate violence, and conversely, why members of those groups might go out into the real world to commit that violence. So this wasn't just to learn about incels in particular, but also to explore general ways that any radicalized echo chamber might behave. O'Donnell identified 4 purposes the incels felt violence served. The first being increased attention. When the van murderer first identified himself as an incel, the incel forum rejoiced because they thought that this was their cause going mainstream. They encouraged one another to post what were essentially like Incel 101 types of messages in the hopes that the murder pushed more new visitors to come to their forum who they could then recruit as new incels. O'Donnell points out that this is common to non-incel terrorists as well. Large-scale violence is often seen as a necessary means to achieve publicity. Purpose number 2 was revenge. Incels were very excited to see a fellow incel enact revenge, not just on women for refusing to have sex with them, but also attractive men for stealing all the women, and on normies in general for not caring about incels. So essentially everyone who doesn't identify as an incel. O'Donnell points out that that too is common across other terrorist ideologies. Even bystanders can't be presumed to be fully innocent, according to them. So while revenge and publicity were considered by nearly all of the incels to be positive outcomes of this event, a smaller but still substantial number clearly felt that the attack also fulfilled the purpose of achieving political goals. This one is a little bit controversial since incels aren't exactly the most politically motivated or politically educated group out there. But there was definitely a pattern of people who thought that the attack would further the goals of rolling back women's rights, for instance, and stopping feminism, which incels often see as being antithetical to their own goals of being able to have sex with whatever woman whenever they want. Any law or societal norm that assumes women are anything other than holes for men to stick things in, per se, is bad to them. The final purpose that O'Donnell noted, I'm taking these a little out of order, is reinforcing masculinity through misogyny. And this is a big one. That's why I saved it for last. O'Donnell found what many other researchers have recently been identifying. There are a few key ways that men in our society perform masculinity. One of those is by having sex with lots of women, or lots of sex with few women. That's one of the markers of a successful manly man. And incels, by their very definition, are missing out on that marker. So what's another common marker of masculinity in our society? Violence. Violence and aggression and anger are seen as masculine traits. And so for many men who desperately want to be accepted as manly, but who aren't having sex, violence is the next acceptable way to demonstrate masculinity. It's interesting because of how many researchers have noted misogynistic violence can be an end in and of itself, but it can also be the underpinning of other terrorist attacks. As the New York Times described in 2019, the man who shot 9 people to death last weekend in Dayton, Ohio, seethed at female classmates and threatened them with violence. The man who massacred 49 people in an Orlando nightclub in 2016 beat his wife while she was pregnant, she told authorities. The man who killed 26 people in a church in Sutherland Springs, Texas in 2017 had been convicted of domestic violence. His ex-wife said he once told her that he could bury her body where no one would ever find it. The motivations of men who commit mass shootings are often muddled, complex, or unknown. But one common thread that connects many of them, other than access to powerful firearms, is a history of hating women, assaulting wives, girlfriends, and female family members, or sharing misogynistic views online, researchers say. The question then is this. Are men who commit domestic violence more likely to go on to commit terrorist acts, or is domestic violence just so common that we happen to find it every time we peer into the background of a new terrorist? Wow, 2 possibilities, each extraordinarily depressing in its own way. That's what makes these studies on incels and terrorism so interesting, because while it's interesting and important to know how self-described incels respond to violence committed in their name, and therefore how they encourage more incels to do the same, you have to understand that incels are just one part of a much larger community that we call the manosphere, which includes pickup artists who treat women as barely sentient sex dolls waiting to be manipulated into sex. There's men's rights activists, MRAs, who spend their time not working on real men's issues like circumcision or suicide, but by harassing feminists like me. And then there's men going their own way who simply dismiss women as lesser animals who are nothing more than a distraction from them achieving nirvana. And that large community of men who to one degree or another openly hate women is in and of itself just one part of a larger society that, despite significant advances over the past century or two, still hates women, still wants to control women, wants to limit women, and wants to kill women. Like, how else do you explain Texas, the second largest and most populous state in the union, outlawing abortion when, research shows this will not necessarily stop abortions from happening, but it will increase the number of women who die trying to get unsafe abortions? That's one reason why it's relatively easy for our media, our government, and our law enforcement agencies to label Islamic terrorism as terrorism. That's the classic American understanding of terrorism since 9/11, to the point that some researchers worry that correctly labeling male and white supremacist violence as terrorism might end up actually harming innocent Muslim people by dragging them into a conversation that they have nothing to do with. And it also may cause people to want to enact counter-terrorism measures that won't necessarily work for these different types of terrorism and might just end up hurting Muslims and other minorities. I link to a complete discussion of all of that below because I'm not going to get into it here. But yeah, find the transcript as usual in the description and you can read up on that. But yes, on 9/11, Al-Qaeda had a clear ideology that Americans recognized as being antithetical to theirs, whether true or not, like they hate our freedom or they hate Christianity. Meanwhile, it's very difficult for those groups to label a male supremacist as a terrorist because his ideology is, I hate women. And our society includes hatred of women as a fundamental tenet. There is a man out there who is genuinely shocked when a misogynist guns down women in a massage parlor, despite the fact that there's a little voice in the back of his head that says, but those whores deserved it. And he's not alone. Our society is full of men like that and women like that. Women also have these misogynistic beliefs that they've grown up believing and never really questioning. So politicians can ban Muslims or ban people from predominantly Muslim countries from immigrating in a theatrical attempt to stop Islamic terrorism. But how can you stop misogynists from living amongst us? They're already here in full force, and far too many people are somewhere on the woman-hating spectrum. As Solzhenitsyn wrote, if only it were all so simple. If only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being, and who is willing to destroy a piece of his own heart? Stopping misogynistic terrorism requires a much more complicated solution than people would like to accept. I mean, that's true of pretty much every type of terrorism, but we're focused on this for now. Over on Reddit, where I actually first noticed this incel study, the commenters illustrate this perfectly. Like this upvoted comment, imagine how different the world would be if religion instead preached the art of courtship and how to engage in witty banter instead of dogmatic principles and absolving accountability. Of course, this has nothing to do with religion, and it also has nothing to do with whether or not these men could get laid. There is no easy solution that says if these incels only got laid, then they would not be violent. That's just not the way it works. And unfortunately, that is a problem with studies that only look at incel violence. It's easy to ignore that incels are just a subsection of a much larger group of misogynistic terrorists who get all the sex they want and still hate women. The actual solution involves complete structural change, a society that values women, that protects their autonomy, where women reporting crimes are treated the same as men reporting crimes, where stalking and harassment are taken seriously by authorities, where men don't have easy access to guns. And unfortunately, we just don't want to do that as a society. So reading this incel study and then reading various other studies about misogyny as a gateway to worse types of terrorism reminded me of one of my stalkers from back in 2012. A Skepchick reader back then sent me a link to this guy's website where he was selling music with titles, lyrics, and images about murdering me. He had clearly spent a lot of time imagining murdering me. And while at that time I had a lot of different men sending me death threats, this guy was unique because he wasn't trying to get my attention to scare me. He was just quietly somewhere fantasizing about murdering me. And that scared me. Also, I found out he lived about a 3-hour drive away from me at the time. I wrote about all of this shortly after it happened, but briefly, the cops didn't care, and the FBI cared at first, but then they just stopped caring. An anonymous person with an IP address from near this guy's hometown started harassing and threatening me via email and social media. So it was escalating, and I let the FBI agent know that I was scheduled to give a talk in that town soon, and I didn't know what to do. The agent told me just do whatever will make you feel better. And that's like the last I ever heard from them. I decided to look this guy up. It's been 10 years. Let's see what he's up to. And I discovered accounts claiming that just 2 years after I warned the FBI about him, he was charged with and convicted of domestic violence for pushing his mother down a flight of stairs. He's now an out and proud Nazi with a YouTube channel called Adolf Stalin and lots of social media pics of him doing Nazi salutes. So yeah, that's me just randomly picking one of my misogynistic stalkers from back in the day as a case study. And yeah, he's now moved on to just being a full-blown Nazi with a domestic abuse history. So some researchers think that this underlying misogyny might be the reason why you often see people of color now joining white supremacist groups. It's not because the white supremacists suddenly are out, telling people of color that they're equal to them. Is that they all found common ground by hating women. And the white supremacists, like the Proud Boys, for instance, get the bonus of hiding their racism behind their minority brothers to be more appealing to the mainstream media. Like, we can't be horrific terrorists. Look, a Mexican guy. Altogether, it's not a pretty picture, but I do think it's great that researchers are continuing to explore how these online echo chambers work, and in order to learn, how these men are being radicalized and why they're going out and murdering a bunch of people. Eventually, one day in the distant future, maybe our governmental authorities will take it upon themselves to look at some of this data and make positive changes. In the meanwhile, I'll continue to just not be surprised every time we learn that there's a new mass shooter with a long history of hating women.